Okay, well, today we are wrapping up in the arena, and many of y'all know that we have two children. Molly and I, our third son, is on the way. I ran into someone who was expecting their third daughter out of three daughters, and they were like, "Yeah, our first two were 29 months apart. Wow, it was so crazy." And I was like, "Yeah, well, that's how much our first two are. Our next one's going to be 17 months apart, so it's crazy." But it's interesting to see as they grow how they're different. That their personalities are very different. When James was born, everybody said, "Wow, he looks so much like Matthew, who's our oldest," and I was like, "Yeah, maybe." And then as they've grown, it's clear that their personalities are very different. And one way you can tell their difference of personalities is the way they use their pointer finger. Okay, and James is very verbal. James is one, and he's very verbal. Even though he can't talk, he's very verbal. He's no, 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 no. He just wants to talk, and he when he points at something, it's like he wants you to look at it with him. It's like, look at that, look at that, and he looks at you like he really wants to engage and get and have a conversation with you. So I just can't wait till he can actually has language to actually communicate with us. Matthew, when he was James's age, would use the pointer finger to say, "I want to go here," like "go there," or "give me that." Like it was an instruction. You do this for me, kind of like a general telling me this is where you go, this is what you do, and a little will there, maybe not a little will, and exerting it. And so now we are experiencing the crossing of wills, right? But between brothers, James gets pushed down a lot. It's great, and but we're experiencing that as as part of parenting. I'm still pretty new to this, but the parents' will crossing the child's will, of course. I mean, like that never happens, but it does happen occasionally. And so we discovered that parenting really, and really maybe all of life, is a lot about managing a battle of wills. Whose will gets done? Whose will gets accomplished as you in a battle of wills? And sometimes we don't manage the battle of wills very well when it comes to relationships. In other words, what happens when wills collide, when your will meets my will, when a parent's will meets a child's will, when a spouse's will meets another spouse's will, or employer and employee, or powers of government, all of these things. What happens when wills collide? I think the parenting relationship is pretty unique among all of these because they are like 2 or 3 years old. I mean, what are they going to do, really? You can then they can cry and scream, but if you can endure that, you pretty much can get your will to be accomplished, right? And you don't want to just totally destroy their will, that they would never exert their will, but also you got to let them know they're not in charge, right? There is a 3-year-old cannot make the best decisions for themselves, and so a parent's will is there, their authority is there to help them to make those right choices. But what about when it comes to a spouse relationship? Let's say a relationship between equals, a husband and wife, or between friends, or parents and children as the children get older, maybe teenage years, or they're grown, they've left the house, or maybe they're in college age or whatever. As you get to that place of more maturity, more responsibility, or even in bigger levels I've talked about with government wills when things collide, what happens when wills collide? And the idea behind this series in the arena, if you're just picking up with us today, is that that we are placed in the arena by God, in the arena of history, in the arena of creation, for a purpose, and that God has made us to carry authority, to be His representatives to creation. This is what is described as being made in His image. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, God creates human beings, and He says, "Let us make them in our image, in our likeness, so they may rule." Being made in the image of God ties into ruling or having authority. In this case, over everything in creation, fish, birds, livestock, all the animals, everything. They rule. The fact that they carry my image, God says, they are to be a reminder to all of creation of who is in charge. You are stewards, you are my representatives, and as a result, you are carrying my authority in all of creation. And, uh, and we talked about this being that we are to be initiators, not to be spectators in the arena of life. And this especially is the case if you are a follower of Jesus, if you are a believer in Jesus Christ. Because the story of the Bible goes is that God made us in His image, but human beings abdicated that authority. They believed the serpent instead of God in the original story, and they blamed each other. They blamed the serpent instead of taking responsibility for what God had made them responsible for. But in Jesus, all of these things are restored. In fact, in Revelation chapter 5, verse 10, in describing all of those who belong to the Lamb or to Jesus, the image of Revelation, it uses powerful imagery, and a lot of times those images are very hard to understand. But the believing community, or those who belong to Jesus, oftentimes in the book of Revelation, are described as wearing white robes, which symbolizes that they are washed, they are clean, they're pure. But they also have crowns, which symbolizes authority and power. And in fact, in Revelation chapter 5, verse 10, it's describing those who do belong to the Lamb, to Jesus, as being a kingdom and priests to serve our God and reigning on the earth. They will reign on the earth. And so the Bible describes you as being someone who is a co-regent with God. You are given incredible authority. You are given the ability to be an initiator, co-regents, reigning with God. And so this raises the question, if we're all given the authority of Jesus, if we carry that authority in our lives and in our relationships, how does that work when my authority butts up against your authority? Or my will as a follower of Jesus comes up against your will as a follower of Jesus? How do we work that out? How do we live that out? How is that managed? Because just kind of like looking at the way things are going, it doesn't look like we're managing it very well. And I would say that as believers in Jesus, that we have a unique calling to be able to manage that well. Now, in the world, like sort of the modus operandi, the way things usually work, is that when it comes to wills colliding, what happens when wills collide? Well, you know what happens, okay? The strong survive. When wills collide, the strong survive. Who has the smartest? Who has the best credentials? Okay? Who has, when it comes to nations colliding, who has the strongest army, the strongest weapons, the highest GDP? All of these are powerful tools to make themselves strong. Okay? Who has the most votes in Congress? Who has the political will to be able to see their agenda through? The strong. Okay? Who is it that is the physically strongest? Who can have the best lawyer? You know, it's all about the strong. When the strong survive, that's who wins when wills collide. But what Paul talks about and what we've seen in Jesus is that something radical has happened. That when wills collide, that when it came to the example that's set for us in Jesus, that the strong came, the strongest one came to earth, and he, instead of enforcing his own will, he submitted his will. He yielded his will. In fact, in a defining, dramatic moment in all of history, right before Jesus was to go to his death the next day, Jesus prays a prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane where he says, "Lord, please save me from this, but let your will be done." He yielded up his will to the will of the Father, and ultimately he gave his life. He died. The strong died. Far from being the one that survived, he yielded, he submitted, he gave his life. And so this radically redefines how we understand what happens, or how we relate to Jesus, who had all authority, who has all authority, yielding up that authority for the good of others. And I think Paul is building on that when he talks about how this is to work in everyday life. In Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21. Because we can talk about how this can work in governments, we can how it will work in policy, and how it works among nations and political parties and all of these communities and, good grief, even like football teams, however you want to talk about it, who survives when wheels collide. But where is it most often worked out? It most often happens in the home, among everyday relationships. The people who live under your roof, your kids, your parents, your siblings, your spouse, your boss, your coworkers, your employees. And it's into this world that Paul says in Ephesians 5:21, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Submit, yield, respect, honor the authority of one another. Why? Out of reverence for Christ, the one who has all authority and who had all authority and who submitted, who yielded, who honored, respected the authority of others, and specifically of his Father and of all of us. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Now I'm going to look at, this is kind of like the theme verse for today. Every other verse we're going to look at, which comes after this, builds on this statement. Excuse me. Every other verse builds on this one. This is important to keep in mind, especially because what you're about to see on the next screen, okay? The next verse, verse 22. This is not controversial at all, but let's just, move along. No, okay. Why, verse 22, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. Okay? And others, you can just say respect, honor their authority. Okay? And what Paul is doing here is he's going to speak to those everyday relationships. Those relationships that in some way or another, they encompass us all. And he starts with the husband-wife relationship. And what Paul says to those who society considered to be in the weaker place, really, in that day, is not shocking. But what he says to those who carried the authority, who were in the powerful place, was very radical. Okay? Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. Not shocking. Not shocking. Wives in that day, literally, they had very little rights, if any. There were a few wealthy women. Lydia was one. She was influenced in the early church. Phoebe was a leader in the early church. But here's Paul saying, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. And one reason I know he says this is because this is just so easy to do, But I can't speak to this. I'm not a wife, okay? And so I'm not going to preach on this. But I think that this verse has to be looked in context of what he says to the husband. Because any husband who says, woman, you need to submit to me, okay? That's not honoring the spirit of submitting to one another out of reverence to Christ. Because what Paul says to the husbands is even more radical than this, okay? And I've heard someone share with me this morning that, he asks wives to respect their husbands because that's what maybe husbands need the most is respect. And what husbands are asked to do for their wives is actually it involves even more sacrifice. Husbands love, maybe more, I don't know, equal sacrifice. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Okay, husbands, here's your example. Jesus dying for his bride, giving himself up for her. Love your wives as Christ loved the church. And what did Jesus do for the church? He yielded what was for his own safety and preference and comfort, and might even say his own will for what was best for her. This is pretty radical. Self-sacrificial love. Submitting to one another. Speaking to parents and children in chapter 6, verse 1, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Okay? Not a shocker here. Obviously, he's speaking to children with believing parents. Respect their authority. Submit to them. Honor them. In the Lord. Everything your parents say to do might not be in the Lord. I mean, if they're not believing parents, and as you get older, that might not be the case. There might be conflicts there. Look at some of Jesus' teachings on that. But here's what he says to parents in verse 4. Fathers, and we can say mothers as well. Parents, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Don't just push them so hard. Don't exasperate them. Okay? Honor, respect them. In a sense, yield to them, for what's best for them. Don't just exert your authority because you can. No. Do so for what is best for them, to bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Now, the next pair, and you can read actually more in the Bible. I'm like skipping over a lot of verses, and I'd encourage you to do that, to kind of read between the lines here. I'm just kind of hitting the highlights. Maybe the most controversial is the next pair that he speaks to. And that's because we look at it from 21st century eyes, where, especially in post-slavery American eyes, speaks to slaves and masters. Ephesians 6:5. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Now, the idea that Paul would even tell a slave to obey their master might seem to be repulsive to us, okay? That he maybe should say, slave, you should do everything you could to be free. Now, I think we'll say that, first of all, Paul lived in a world where slavery had always existed, and he could not imagine a place where it would not exist. And the fact that Paul is speaking to believing slaves to tell them to honor their masters is not an endorsement of the institution of slavery. Because many times people who are in this situation, without the protection of their master, they could be even a more vulnerable place. Honor, respect, submit. But here's where it gets really radical. And this puts this whole teaching in perspective. And in fact, I think Paul's sentence here is just opening up the door to what he really wants to say. Because probably not a huge number of slaves are going to be reading this. They might hear it being read to them. But who is the one who holds the authority? It's the masters. And look at what Paul says to them in verse 9. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. What? Honor them. Honor them. Respect them. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. In other words, the hint is their master and yours. You are equals. You are equal to your slave. He will answer to your master, and you will answer to the same master. So you better show them respect. That is radical. Slaves, submit to your masters. Masters, submit to your slaves. The radical community of love. And if you can think about, you live in a world and a community where people are looking out for what's best for one another. That is what he perceives. This is what he imagines here. And so we see all of this is under that context of submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. And we see that submission, at least the way Paul is speaking about it here, that submission isn't a sign of advocating authority, or that you don't have, that you are denying your authority. No. In fact, submission is a sign of security in one's authority. The fact that you don't have to always exert it. The fact that you don't have to always get your way. that it doesn't have to be always to be done the way you want it to be done, is a sign of security in your authority. And also, it's an example, or it's what's modeled for us, that we ultimately in God Himself. Because we're not just submitting to someone who's higher authority than us, because we have to. No, we're submitting in a community of equals. And this is exactly what's modeled for us in the Godhead, in God. This is what we believe as Christians, and this is what makes us unique among all different people of different belief systems, of Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, all Hinduism, all these. Some believe in many gods, some believe in one God. We believe in one God as three persons. We are very different. We're radical. We believe God is love, and we say God is love because God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, has existed in a love relationship for all eternity. And what we see modeled in the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is literally a microcosm community of love, submitting, yielding to one another. This is what Jesus said. We see it in Jesus' teaching in John chapter 14, verse 10. He says, this is Jesus talking. He says, the words I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority. Is it because Jesus didn't have authority? No, He has ultimate authority. He has equal authority with God the Father. But He says, rather, it is the Father living in me who's doing His work. He said over and over, I'm just doing what I see my Father doing. It's not me, it's the Father doing His work in me. He gave all credit to the Father. He yielded to the Father's will when He prayed in the Garden of Eden. It's all about the Father. He always pointed toward, honored the Father. Not because the Son is less than the Father, but because the Son yields, submits out of love to the respect of the Father. And in John chapter 16, verse 14, in speaking about the Holy Spirit, Jesus says, He, the Spirit, will glorify me because it is from me that He will receive what He will make known to you. The Holy Spirit, who is equal to Jesus and the Father, who has equal power, equal authority, but He yields that authority to give glory to Jesus. And that's why when you're in worship, you're in church, you're not like, oh, Holy Spirit, Holy Spirit, Holy. You're not. You're Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. It's because it's the Holy Spirit at work in you to give glory to Jesus who has saved you by obeying the Father. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, yielding, submitting out of love for one another. And so we see authority when it is exercised, as we see it modeled for us in the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, is always exercised as an act of love, to give glory, to lift up, to empower another, which is what we see in God creating us and giving us authority. And so, submission, or in thinking about this and submitting to each other in light of this, in a community and that's modeled for us by God, submitting means honoring another's authority, not relinquishing yours. Not to say you don't have authority, but that you willingly, as in a community of equals, that you honor that authority of another person. How would that change how we interacted and related to people in a community of when wills collide? That if we honored the other's authority as much as our own, and honoring our own authority doesn't mean that we just throw it out the window, that we just leave the arena. We say, well, I have no authority. No, you do have authority. Sometimes we need to own that authority that we have. And that's what the other sermons in this series have been about. But submitting means honoring another's authority, not relinquishing yours. It doesn't mean that you have to get your way, but it doesn't mean that you never get your way. It means that we live in a community where we respect the authority of others. Our goal is to empower them. Our pediatrician is a longtime pediatrician here in Montgomery. His name is Den Trumbull. I know some of you know him, and maybe he's your pediatrician too, or you have other pediatricians in his practice. He wrote a book. It's called Loving by Leading, and he's given me some kickback for mentioning it in the service today. You can buy it on Amazon. No, just kidding. But I did read it in preparing for this sermon series, Because the book is, in fact, the book itself gave me the idea for this series several months ago. And the idea is that as loving by leading, and this is speaking to parents, but it can be any relationship, that we are given responsibility to lead. And if we don't lead, we're not loving. The way that we show love to our kids is by leading them and by using our influence and authority to be in the arena, to seeking to influence them. And this is not just true in parenting. It's true in every relationship. It's true in your community, and it's true in all of life. But he quotes, he names some different approaches to parenting that a sociologist named Diana Baumrind, that she identified. And I want to cover three main approaches. And they all based or dependent upon levels of demandingness and responsiveness. Say this with me, demandingness. Say it, demandingness. Make sure you're awake at that, demandingness. And responsiveness. Say responsiveness. You're all asleep. You're asleep, but hey, you're here. Okay, demandingness and responsiveness. Demandingness being what you expect for them, sort of exerting your authority. I'm the parent, And responsive being, like I want to be your friend kind of thing, And so we would probably include submitting to one another in love as being part of being responsive, right? And so you hear this sermon on submission, on submitting, yielding, honoring each other's authority. You might think that the way to parent, or the way to best parenting, is to be low in demandingness and high in responsiveness. After all, we don't want to exasperate. We want to love them and encourage them in the Lord. And so this is what's actually referred to as the permissive approach, that we're very permission-giving. Actually, the results in the study show that this is not the best way of parenting, the best method for children that are high-functioning in relationships, who are secure in themselves, who succeed, excel in school and in life. They actually may feel even actually more insecure in that case. And so what happens sometimes is that some go the opposite way. And maybe you've been permissive for a while and you see this is not working, and so they go to be high in demandingness, high in exerting that authority, and low in responses. Well, I don't care. I don't care if I'm not saying there are times you say, I don't care if you don't like it. There are times like that, but to be not considering at all. And what happens here is that while the child may fear you and obey, they're going to go off and do what they want later. They're going to quietly rebel. And the authoritarian is not the best as well. Instead, for highest functioning, for the most secure kids, and to help them to best set them up to succeed in life and for emotional and spiritual health, is what he describes as the authoritative approach, which is high in demandingness and high in responsiveness. In other words, you're aware, you're quick to respond, you're quick to be sensitive to their needs, but you don't back down at all in what you expect. Both. This actually produces the best environment for a child to excel. You are loving and you are leading. And here's where it really gets down to what authority is all about and why God has given it to us and how we see it modeled in the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Is that authority is always exercised as an act of love. Authority is given out of love. Authority is to be used for purposes of love. Your place in the arena, and you have a place in the arena, it was never about you. It's always about empowering others to get into the arena, to make a difference. Not just being an influencer yourself, but to be an influencer and to be an initiator that raises up even more initiators. You don't have authority to control just for the purposes of having it. It's to be used to not to subject someone, but to bless someone. And ultimately it comes down to this. It comes down to this, is that especially on this topic of submitting and respecting and honoring the authority of others, we honor the authority of others, including that of fellow believers, those who are equal. and even in our kids, we honor the authority of others because we honor the authority of God. Not just those who have authority over us, but those who have authority who are equal to us. We honor their authority because we honor the authority of God. And I believe this is the kind of living that's described when Jesus speaks in Matthew chapter 7, verse 7. Most of the time we associate this with prayer, but I don't think he's talking about just prayer. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you. We think about that in terms of prayer, right? And I think Jesus is definitely talking about our relationship with God. But I think it applies to our relationship with each other. I could demand, I could force you, but I will ask you out of respect for your authority to say no. And what I've discovered is that as a person who has authority, I mean, I'm the pastor of this church. I mean, I have authority in many respects, and different. I'm an employer, and that I'm a boss. What I've discovered is that if you honor the authority of others, they'll be more likely to honor yours. Honoring another's authority makes them more likely to honor yours. We are called to be in the arena, but we aren't just to be in the arena. We are to reshape the arena after the image of Jesus. So be an initiator, not a spectator, when it comes to honoring, when it comes to submitting. Because ultimately in doing so, we are following the example of the ultimate initiator, who when the chips were down in the defining moment, he prayed, Lord, if you are willing, but not your will, not my will, but your will be done. And as a result of his honoring of the Father's authority, the authority of Jesus is now known and honored and respected in the whole world because of what he's done for you. So let's follow his example. When wills collide, not to back down, not to deny our authority, but to honor that of others.